How does a man sworn to save souls become a master of unspeakable cruelty? The stench of decay mixed with muffled cries filled the hidden underground chamber. This was no sanctuary, it was a prison, one built by a man of God. The air was damp, thick with the smell of mold and human despair. A single, flickering bulb dangled precariously from the low ceiling, casting grotesque shadows across the stone walls. Chains clinked softly in the dim light, the sound of hopelessness echoing off the cold, unyielding surfaces. When the officers descended into the concealed pit, their boots sank into the damp earth. Their flashlights pierced the darkness, illuminating a scene they would never forget. 13 women sat huddled together, their bodies frail and battered, their faces hollow masks of exhaustion and terror. They flinched at the sudden intrusion, their eyes darting toward the door as though unsure whether salvation or further torment awaited. This was the unholy domain of Pastor Elijah Kane, a man revered in his small, devout community. He had stood before his congregation every Sunday, preaching love, forgiveness, and the path to salvation. But beneath the righteous facade lay a monstrous truth. For years, he had lured women into his trap, promising sanctuary and spiritual guidance, only to strip them of their freedom and humanity. The room bore silent witness to his cruelty. Chains bolted into the walls, stained mattresses on the floor, and a single bucket in the corner told the story of unrelenting captivity. Words carved into the stone, a desperate prayer, a name, or a plea for help, spoke of lives reduced to shadows, voices silenced in the darkness. One officer stepped forward, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "We've got survivors," he said into his radio, though his tone held no triumph. The women clung to each other, their skeletal frames trembling as if they could shatter at the slightest touch. One reached out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it over?" she asked, her words carrying the weight of years spent in unspeakable torment. It was the end of their nightmare, but only the beginning of the questions. How could this happen? How did a man entrusted with guiding souls to salvation become the architect of such a hellish existence? As sunlight began to filter into the dungeon for the first time, it revealed the stark contrast between the world above and the horrors below. A sanctuary had turned into a tomb. Trust had been betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. And for these 13 women, freedom now came with scars that might never heal. The world would soon learn the truth about Pastor Elijah Kane. But for now, the echoes of his crimes lingered in the suffocating silence of his secret dungeon, where salvation was just a lie, and suffering was the only reality. Pastor Elijah Kane had been the heart of the community, a man whose very presence seemed to radiate warmth and wisdom. His sermons were the kind that drew tears, speaking of redemption, hope, and the boundless love of God. Each Sunday, his voice would rise like a crescendo, filling the pews with conviction. Families left the church inspired, clinging to his words as though they were a lifeline in a world fraught with chaos. His charity work was the stuff of legend. Widows received unexpected help with their bills. Children without fathers found themselves gifted new bicycles at Christmas. Elijah Kane's name was spoken with reverence, whispered in prayers, and scrawled across banners at town events. His disarming smile, always framed by his perfectly combed silver hair, carried an almost otherworldly charm. But beneath that charm lurked a sinister truth. Rumors had swirled for years, faint whispers carried on the wind. Women in the congregation had disappeared without a trace, runaways, they said. Young women from troubled homes who had sought solace in Pastor Kane's guidance only to vanish, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and grieving families. Each time, Kane would stand at the pulpit, speaking with a voice heavy with sorrow. "Pray for their safe return," he'd urge, and the congregation would nod solemnly, never suspecting that their trusted shepherd was the wolf. There were whispers, too, of impropriety. Women claimed his touch lingered too long during prayers or that his gaze felt invasive, but these concerns were dismissed as baseless. "He's a man of God," the elders would say, their tones almost scolding. "How dare you question his intentions?" And so, the rumors faded, buried beneath the pastor's seemingly unblemished reputation. His image remained untarnished, a pillar of moral certainty in a fractured world. But behind closed doors, Cain was weaving a web of manipulation, cloaking his darkness in the sanctity of his role. As the truth would later reveal, every act of kindness, every tearful sermon, and every disarming smile had been a carefully constructed mask, hiding the monstrous reality that festered beneath. The sound of a crowbar against the cellar door echoed like a death knell, each strike reverberating through the hollow silence of the house. Officers worked in grim determination, prying open a hidden trapdoor they had found beneath a threadbare rug in the basement. When the door gave way, the acrid stench that poured out made even the most hardened among them recoil. Detective Marie Lawson, a 15-year veteran of the force, was the first to descend into the darkness. Her flashlight swept across the cramped space, the beam catching glimpses of stained walls, rusted chains, and discarded scraps of rotting food. For a moment, she froze. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of her heart. One by one, the women came into view, 13 in total, their skeletal frames huddled together like frightened animals. Their faces were gaunt, hollowed by years of starvation. Bruises in varying stages of healing mottled their arms and legs, while some bore scars that told of unspeakable cruelty. They flinched at the light, their sunken eyes wide with terror, flickering between fear and the faintest glimmer of hope. One woman, her face smeared with dirt and tears, crawled forward. Her voice was raspy, almost inaudible. "Please, don't hurt us." The officer nearest to her knelt down, his hands trembling as he reassured her. "You're safe now. We're here to help." But even his words sounded hollow in the suffocating air of the dungeon. The investigators felt a wave of emotions, shock, disgust, and righteous anger, as the full scope of Cain's depravity came into focus. The women had been imprisoned here for years, their lives stolen by the very man they had trusted. Detective Lawson clenched her jaw, fury simmering beneath her professional exterior. "What kind of monster does this?" she muttered, her voice tight with restrained rage. As they began the painstaking process of helping the women out of the cellar, the grim evidence of their ordeal became clear. Chains bolted into the walls, tattered mattresses reeking of urine and sweat, and crude markings etched into the stone, names, tally marks, and desperate prayers for freedom, painted a harrowing picture of their suffering. It was during this rescue that the truth of Cain's crimes began to emerge. Survivors spoke haltingly of the horrors they had endured: beatings, starvation, and relentless psychological control. Some admitted, through broken sobs, that Cain had used his position to commit the vilest of acts. He would preach about salvation during the day, and under the cover of night, descend into the cellar to exploit the women he held captive. His words twisted scripture into justification, telling them their suffering was penance, their servitude an act of devotion. For years, they had lived in a nightmare they thought would never end. Now, as sunlight touched their faces for the first time in years, they clung to each other, tears streaming down their cheeks. For these women, freedom came with a terrible price, one that would haunt them forever. Above ground, officers emerged one by one, their faces pale and drawn. Detective Lawson turned to her partner, her voice shaking with barely contained emotion. This wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal of everything people believe in. As news of the discovery spread, the community would soon learn the unthinkable truth about their beloved pastor. But for now, in the quiet chaos of that cellar, the weight of his sins was enough to suffocate. For most of the women, it had begun with hope. Pastor Cain had offered them sanctuary when their lives were unraveling, promises of shelter, safety, and spiritual guidance that felt like salvation. Each of them had a story, a reason they fell into his orbit: a young runaway fleeing an abusive home, a single mother desperate to escape poverty, or a devout believer seeking solace after a personal tragedy. He had seen their vulnerabilities and exploited them with chilling precision. The flashbacks of their ordeals played out like fragments of a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting unspeakable suffering. One woman, Maria, remembered the first time she realized she was trapped. Kane had locked the door behind her, his kind smile replaced by something colder, something sinister. "This is where you'll find your redemption," he had said, leading her to the dark, cramped room that would become her prison. The chains came next, cold steel that bit into her wrists and ankles, erasing any illusion of safety. Another woman, Eliza, spoke of the twisted sermons he would deliver in the depths of the night. "Your suffering cleanses you," he would preach, pacing the dimly lit cellar as they huddled together. "This is God's will. You are chosen to bear this burden." His words were like poison, seeping into their minds until resistance felt futile. But resistance did exist. One victim, Tasha, had fought back in the beginning. She remembered the slap that sent her sprawling to the ground, the sting of humiliation as Kane towered over her. "You don't defy me," he had snarled, his voice a far cry from the gentle pastor the town knew. Over time, the fight within her had dulled, beaten down by starvation, isolation, and the endless cycle of abuse. Despite the horrors, each woman clung to fragments of her humanity, scraps of hope that refused to be extinguished. They whispered their names to each other in the dark, determined not to forget who they were. Maria dreamed of reuniting with her son. Eliza hummed lullabies to herself, a bittersweet reminder of the life she had lost. Tasha carved tally marks into the walls, counting the days, refusing to let time slip away unnoticed. Kane's methods of control were as calculated as they were cruel. Fear was his weapon of choice. Threats of violence, starvation, and even death kept them submissive. But he wielded false hope just as effectively. Occasionally, he would promise release, dangling the possibility of freedom like a cruel mirage. "Prove your devotion," he would say, forcing them into degrading acts under the guise of spiritual purification. His manipulation extended to their minds, warping their sense of reality. He claimed to be their savior, their only connection to the outside world. Over time, some of the women began to doubt themselves, questioning whether escape was even possible. Yet, beneath the surface, their courage simmered. They shared whispered dreams of freedom, comforted one another in the dark, and found strength in their unity. 4 years, they endured unimaginable suffering, but they never completely surrendered their will to survive. The flashbacks painted a grim tapestry of resilience amidst horror, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. For these women, their ordeal was a battle fought in silence, their survival an act of quiet defiance. The tip that broke the case came in the form of a single, trembling voice on the other end of a hotline. The caller remained anonymous, their words fragmented and whispered, as though they feared being overheard. "Check the basement," they had said before abruptly hanging up. Detective Marie Lawson and her team had dismissed it at first, another false lead in a world teeming with paranoia. But something about the call gnawed at Lawson's instincts. They decided to investigate, not expecting the horror that awaited them. The raid on Pastor Kane's home began quietly, under the cover of dawn. Officers approached cautiously, their breaths visible in the chilly morning air. The pastor himself had answered the door, his expression one of serene confusion. "What's all this about?" he asked, his voice as calm and measured as it was from the pulpit. But the mask slipped when they asked to see the basement. His smile faltered, his hand gripping the doorframe a little too tightly. "There's nothing down there," he said quickly, his voice laced with an edge of panic. It was all the confirmation they needed. The team found the trapdoor within minutes, concealed beneath an old rug. The journals came next, hidden in a locked cabinet in Kane's study. They were leather-bound, meticulously organized, and each page told a story more horrifying than the last. Detective Lawson sat at the desk, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Kane's handwriting was neat, almost elegant, as he detailed his crimes in chilling precision. He had written about each woman, describing their vulnerabilities, their resistance, and how he broke them. He referred to them as vessels, stripping them of their humanity in his words as thoroughly as he had in his actions. The journals also revealed his obsession with control. He wrote about the psychological tactics he used to manipulate his victims, blending scripture with his twisted ideology. He seemed to relish their suffering, recording their pleas for mercy as though they were trophies. For the officers involved, the case was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Hardened detectives, accustomed to the worst humanity had to offer, found themselves shaken to their cores. One officer had to step outside, the bile rising in his throat as he read about the abuses in excruciating detail. Another, younger detective, wiped at his eyes furiously, refusing to let his tears fall. Detective Lawson, however, stayed rooted to her chair, her jaw clenched tightly. She had seen cruelty before, but never on this scale, and never from someone who had been so deeply trusted. "This isn't just evil," she murmured to herself. "This is calculated, deliberate destruction." Piece by piece, the team pieced together Kane's crimes. Witness interviews, forensic evidence, and the damning journals formed an airtight case. But for all the clarity the evidence provided, one question lingered in the minds of the investigators. How had he hidden his darkness so well for so long? As they prepared to make the arrest, Lawson couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of Kane's depravity. She knew the worst was still to come, when the world would hear the victims' stories, and the man behind the pulpit would finally be unmasked as the monster he truly was. News of Pastor Kane's arrest spread through the community like wildfire, shattering the carefully constructed facade he had built over decades. Parishioners who had once hung on his every word now gathered in hushed clusters, their faces pale and their voices trembling with disbelief. How could this happen? They asked each other, their words tinged with both shock and desperation. How could a man we trusted with our faith and families be capable of such evil? For many, it felt like a betrayal on a cosmic scale. Kane hadn't just been a pastor. He had been a symbol of hope, a guiding light in their darkest moments. Parents recalled bringing their children to his sermons, entrusting them to his care during youth retreats and counseling sessions. Families remembered sharing meals with him, their homes filled with his booming laughter and gentle reassurances. To learn that this same man had used his position to commit unspeakable atrocities was almost too much to bear. Rage quickly followed disbelief. Small-town loyalty gave way to fiery indignation as more details of his crimes emerged. Community members gathered outside the church, their placards declaring justice for the victims and no mercy for monsters. Some threw stones at the building, their anger transforming into a physical need to destroy the place that had become a symbol of their pain. But the anger wasn't universal. For others, guilt weighed heavily. Some admitted to feeling uneasy around Kane but had dismissed their instincts out of fear of questioning a man of God. "Maybe if we'd said something," one elderly woman whispered to a friend, her voice breaking. "Maybe those women would have been saved." Others felt paralyzed by the enormity of their blind trust. "He baptized my son," one man muttered bitterly, staring at his hands as though they, too, carried some blame. "How could I not have seen it?" Amid the grief and guilt, there was also a steely determination to seek justice. The community rallied around the survivors, organizing fundraisers and support groups to help them rebuild their lives. Church leaders, horrified by the betrayal, vowed to assist in any way they could, offering counseling services and cooperating fully with law enforcement. But even as they tried to move forward, the shadow of Kane's crimes lingered. The church, once a beacon of hope, now felt tainted. Attendance dwindled, and some parishioners stopped coming altogether, unable to reconcile their faith with the horrors that had unfolded within those walls. For years, Kane had been the center of their community, a man they had trusted with their souls. Now, that trust was shattered, leaving behind a void filled with anger, guilt, and questions that might never have answers. The courtroom was packed, a silent tension blanketing the air. Every seat was taken, with reporters lining the back wall and community members craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had once been their pastor. Pastor Elijah Kane sat at the defense table, his expression unervingly calm. Dressed in a dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, He looked more like the man who had preached sermons of hope than the monster his victims described. But the victims were there, too, their presence a silent testimony to his crimes. One by one, they stepped onto the witness stand, their voices trembling as they recounted the horrors they had endured. Maria, clutching a tissue in her hands, described the moment Cain had locked her in the basement. "He told me God wanted me to stay there," she said, her voice cracking. "He said it was for my salvation." Her tears fell freely as she detailed years of abuse, her words painting a picture of unimaginable suffering. Eliza followed, her voice firmer but her hands trembling as she spoke. She described the twisted sermons Cain would deliver in the dungeon, how he used scripture to justify his actions. "He told us we were chosen," she said, her eyes flashing with anger. "Chosen to suffer for the sins of the world." The courtroom gasped as the prosecution introduced the journals. Detective Lawson took the stand to explain their contents, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her disgust. "He detailed everything," she said. "Every act, every manipulation, every moment of suffering. He wrote about it as if it were an art form." The judge allowed portions of the journals to be read aloud, and the audience recoiled at the cold precision of Cain's words. But the most electrifying moment came when Tasha took the stand. She didn't flinch as she locked eyes with Cain. Her voice was strong, her words deliberate. "You don't own me anymore," she said, her tone defiant. "You took everything from me, but you couldn't break me. And now, you'll never hurt anyone else." Cain's reaction was chilling. He sat motionless, his face a blank canvas. No remorse, no regret, only an unsettling indifference that sent shivers through the room. It was as if he were detached from the proceedings, watching them unfold as a passive observer rather than the man on trial. The closing arguments were equally charged. The prosecutor's voice rang out, filled with righteous fury. "This man," he said, pointing at Cain, "used his position to prey on the vulnerable, to strip these women of their humanity. He is a wolf in shepherd's clothing, and justice demands that we hold him accountable." The defense lawyer tried to spin a narrative of Cain's supposed mental instability, arguing that he believed his own twisted rhetoric. But the jury remained unmoved. When the verdict was finally delivered, the room erupted. "Guilty," the foreperson announced, the word hanging in the air like a long-awaited exhale. Cain showed no reaction, his face as impassive as ever. The survivors wept, holding one another tightly as relief washed over them. But for some, the victory was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars Cain had left, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. As the courtroom emptied, questions lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. How had he deceived so many for so long? How many more like him walk among us, hidden in plain sight? And most haunting of all, could anyone have stopped him sooner? As the courtroom emptied and the case of Pastor Elijah Cain moved into history, the echoes of his crimes lingered. Justice had been served, but the questions his actions raised were far from answered. How had a man so deeply trusted managed to commit such atrocities for years, hidden in plain sight? How many people had ignored the whispers, dismissed the signs, or chosen silence over confrontation? The community's trust in Cain had been absolute, a faith so blind it had allowed him to wield unchecked power. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of placing unwavering belief in a single figure, especially one cloaked in authority. How many others like him hide behind masks of righteousness? How many more predators exploit positions of power to manipulate, abuse, and destroy? Cain's case also highlighted the complicity of silence. The rumors had been there, the inappropriate touches, the missing women, the unease some had felt in his presence. Yet, for years, nothing was done. The fear of questioning a man of God, of disrupting the fragile harmony of the community, had outweighed the need to act. The abuse of authority wasn't new, but its persistence was chilling. How often does society excuse harmful behavior when it comes from someone perceived as untouchable? How often do we protect institutions over individuals, fearing the fallout of the truth more than the damage of lies. These were not easy questions, but they were necessary ones. The case of Pastor Elijah Kane was a reminder of the fragility of trust, the importance of vigilance, and the cost of silence. And for the survivors, the scars remained. Could they rebuild their lives after such profound trauma? Could they reclaim their identities, their sense of safety, their faith in humanity? In the end, Kane's crimes weren't just about one man's monstrosity. They were about the systems, beliefs, and fears that allowed him to thrive. And until those systems were questioned, until those fears were confronted, the question would remain: how many more Elijah Kanes are out there, hiding behind the guise of virtue, waiting to strike? The story of Pastor Elijah Kane leaves us with difficult but necessary questions. How can we ensure that the most vulnerable, women, children, and the marginalized, are protected from those who abuse their power? What can we do to break free from the blind trust and unchecked authority that allow predators to thrive in plain sight? This case is a chilling reminder that silence and complicity are predators' greatest allies. It forces us to ask, how do we create communities that encourage vigilance and courage, where victims feel empowered to speak, and where the warning signs are never ignored? The survivors' strength is undeniable, but their stories call on all of us to act. How can we challenge manipulative ideologies and protect others from falling prey to those who twist trust into a weapon? Let these questions linger. Let them spark conversations and actions that ensure such horrors are never repeated. If this story has moved you, help us continue to uncover the truth and amplify the voices of survivors. Subscribe to the channel, share this story, and join us in building a world where no one suffers in silence. Change starts here.